When you think of Paul's missionary efforts 2,000 years ago, or those who served in tribal communities like the Brileys that we support in New Guinea, does it seem to you that they have much in common with those who try to witness in America today? Is there any commonality between someone who worships the sun, the moon, and the stars and someone who thinks there's nothing to worship at all? Consider what spiritual needs all men and women have in common as we continue to study Paul's first missionary journey here in Acts chapter 14, beginning in the first 7 verses. It says, "At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. There they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Gentiles believed. But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So Paul and Barnabas spent considerable time there, speaking boldly for the Lord, who confirmed the message of his grace by enabling them to do miraculous signs and wonders. The people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, others with the apostles. There was a plot afoot among the Gentiles and Jews, together with their leaders, to mistreat them and stone them. But they found out about it and fled to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe and to the surrounding country, where they continued to preach the good news." So here we have Paul at Iconium, where he has initial success followed by resistance. So Paul has just been expelled from the province of Phrygia. Paul and Barnabas now travel 80 miles southeast to the city of Iconium in the province of Galatia. As usual, Paul first enters the synagogue at Iconium to share the gospel with the Jewish community there. Like at Pisidian Antioch, Paul's message is positively received at first. And even more so here, because not only did they want to hear more about Jesus, but we're told that a great number of Jews and Gentiles believed. Those who did not accept the gospel, however, were not content to let Paul and Barnabas continue to minister in their midst, so they poisoned their minds against the brothers. They probably spread lies about what Paul was hoping to accomplish, what he was really about. Maybe they portrayed the gospel as something that would destroy Judaism by being flooded with Gentiles. I don't know what their thing was, but they poisoned the people's minds against Paul. This time, however, Paul and Barnabas stay and continue to work, fighting back against those that are trying to sabotage their work, speaking boldly in the defense of the gospel. We're told that God confirmed their message of grace by giving them miraculous signs and wonders to do. You see, as God sometimes chooses to do, he backs Paul and Barnabas up by giving them the power to proclaim and perform miracles, along with the power of the message itself. The question we might have here today is simple. Why doesn't God throw a little bit of that miracle-working power our way? Wouldn't crowds throng to hear the gospel if it could be testified to by the lame walking, the blind receiving sight, and the deaf hearing? You and I would certainly think so. It would bolster our faith to see such power and mercy at work. But the Bible shows again and again that miracles do not create faith, nearly as often as you might think they would. Moses had tremendous difficulty with an unbelieving people, even though they had all witnessed the plagues in Egypt, even though they had all walked together through the Red Sea, and even though they were all traveling through the desert following a pillar of fire. If that isn't enough proof to make someone believe, then no amount of demonstration of God's power will be enough to turn a heart that is set against God. The response in Iconium was typical. Those who believed were encouraged by the miracles. Those who refused to believe simply hardened their hearts, just as Pharaoh had done in the face of God's plagues in Egypt. The evidence of God's existence and mankind's sinfulness is all around us. Those who choose not to see it are unlikely to be persuaded by more proof, even if it takes the form of a miracle. We learned that there was a plot afoot. People started to conspire against Paul and Barnabas. When the Pharisees and Sadducees could not contend with the wisdom or the power of Jesus, they conspired to kill him. That same blunt solution is now in the minds of those who reject Paul and Barnabas. The plot is uncovered in time for them to flee the city and go to the neighboring town of Lystra, 24 miles more southeast, continuing along the great Roman road that traveled between Ephesus and the Euphrates River. Thus far, the missionary efforts of Paul and Barnabas on behalf of the gospel of Jesus Christ have met with both enthusiastic acceptance and violent resistance. But is that any wonder? God is offering salvation of our very souls, a free gift of grace through faith. Well, that is certainly worth much joy. But God is also proclaiming the sinfulness of man and judging all efforts to save ourselves to be misguided and futile. Now that will be self-evident to the ears of those that are willing to repent, but it will cause anger and resentment amongst those that are full of pride, who will not bend their knee, not even to their Creator. The gospel always has, and always will have, a mixed reaction, just as Jesus himself was both loved and hated. As we continue now in the story in verses 8 through 13, in Lystra there sat a man crippled in his feet, who was lame from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed, and called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw that what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates, because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. So now Paul is speaking in the next city, and he heals a man that has been lame from birth. Now there is no mention of Paul going into the synagogue at Lystra, perhaps because the Jewish community here in this smaller town was too small to support one. The upcoming misunderstanding between Paul and Barnabas and the local population also lends weight to the supposition that the people of Lystra knew nothing of Jewish traditions. Thus, Lystra may represent the very first missionary effort among people that are not at all familiar with the self-revelation of God to Abraham and his descendants. As Paul is about to realize, that kind of cross-cultural exchange can be a bumpy ride. So while he preached to the people of Lystra, probably standing up in the town square, speaking to those passing by, and doing business in the market, Paul notices a man paying close attention to him. The avid listener was a man born lame. He had never walked. When Paul looked at him, he somehow could tell that this man believed in his message about God and Jesus. He had, as Acts tells us, faith to be healed. Now that's an amazing thing for a man born lame to have. The gods or the fates or whatever the people of Lystra blamed for this man's deformity had not been kind at all to him. And yet, when Paul came proclaiming the gospel, he began to have faith. So now Paul, like Peter and Jesus before him, takes advantage of the faith he finds in an unexpected place by telling the man, "Stand up on your feet." And like the man Peter healed in Acts chapter 3, this man responds to the command to walk by jumping to his feet. I don't know how many people were listening to this stranger talking about some God before he healed a man that they all knew to be lame since birth. But I know Paul has their attention now. Unfortunately for Paul and Barnabas, this act of God's healing mercy is about to set the law of unintended consequences into motion. So how do the Lycaonians react to the miracle? Takes some explaining. The Roman poet Ovid had written a legend about the hill country of Galatia, where this story takes place, in a poem called Metamorphosis. Ovid's poem would have been familiar to many people throughout the empire, especially those living near where it was supposed to have taken place. In that legend, Zeus and Hermes took on human form and traveled around the area in search of hospitality. Now, hospitality is famous in Greek literature. It has the word xenia. That's the Greek word for hospitality. It's a big deal in Greek myths and legends. I'll illustrate from Homer's two most famous works. In the Iliad, Paris violates the role of a guest by abducting Priam's wife Helen, thus starting the Trojan War. He violated hospitality. In Homer's Odyssey, the climactic scenes involve the contrast between the hospitality of the swineherder Emmaus, who was kind to Odysseus even though he was in disguise as a beggar, contrasted with the rudeness of the suitors to Odysseus, still in disguise, in his own home, where these men are trying to win the hand of his wife, whom all presume to be a widow. At the end of the story, Odysseus wreaks his vengeance on these suitors. It is seen as appropriate in their culture because they didn't respect xenia. So in this local legend now, Zeus and Hermes are unable to find anyone to give them shelter. Even though they go to 1,000 homes, nobody will give them shelter for the night. Nobody will give them food. Until one old couple, Philemon and Baucis, invite them in despite their poverty and share with them their meal. So what does all this about Xenia and Homer and Ovid have to do with Paul and Barnabas healing some lame man? Actually, it turned out to have everything to do with it. Because the people of Lystra knew that legend well. They also knew that Ovid's story ends with the destruction of the homes of those 1,000 people who were not hospitable, and the elevation of the humble shack of that one old couple into a gleaming, beautiful temple. So they're not about to repeat the mistake of those who neglected Xenia in the past. As soon as Paul and Barnabas demonstrate divine power, they proclaim them as Zeus and Hermes, come back to test them a second time, and they rush to worship them by offering sacrifices. At this point, a language barrier gets in the way. Luke tells us that the crowd's shouting is going on in the local dialect, the Lycaonian language, and not in Greek. So Paul and Barnabas have no idea what the crowd is so excited about or what they're about to do. There are two big problems about to blow up because of the runaway enthusiasm of this crowd. Number one, Paul and Barnabas are about to be the object of worship, which is blasphemy of the kind that cost Herod his life earlier in Acts. And number two, the crowd is about to find out that these quote-unquote gods that they think are walking among them are not gods at all, but just men. Let's continue and see what happens with that, verses 14 through 17. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Men, why are you doing this? We too are only men, human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made heaven and earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go on their way. Yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Barnabas and Paul figure it out. At some point, probably when they saw the priest of Zeus leading a bull with a wreath on it, they would have recognized what that meant. They realized that 2 and 2 makes 4. They are coming here to sacrifice to us. At this moment, two very different cultures are about to react in opposite ways. The people of Lystra are in the middle of a celebration. thinking that the gods whose stories they were raised on have come down to earth to bless them. They're in a party mood. Paul and Barnabas, raised to honor and revere the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, know that there is only one God, that all other gods are mere idols of wood or stone. To worship anything other than God himself and God alone is blasphemy. As pious Jews, along with being committed Christians, Paul and Barnabas do the culturally required thing when blasphemy is heard. They tear their clothes. The tearing of clothes in the culture of ancient Judaism was a sign of mourning. When the people refused to enter the promised land, Joshua tore his clothes in despair. Likewise, when the high priest thought he heard Jesus blaspheme, when he answered, "I am," to the question, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" he tore his clothes. The crowd of would-be worshippers must have been perplexed, if not mortified. Here they are, rushing to fulfill their obligation as the hosts of Zeus and Hermes, to fulfill the demands of Xenia, and the apparent gods in disguise have just ripped their clothes and run into the crowd telling them to stop. More than a little bit confused, I'm sure. Something is terribly wrong. Likewise, Paul, who had healed a man by the power of God out of compassion, now has to find a way to undo the damage that this miracle has caused. How can Paul convince the crowd to abandon worthless idols and worship the one true God? He begins by saying, "We too are only men, human like you." Now that is contrary to the advice of Dr. Peter Venkman in Ghostbusters, who said if someone asks you if you are a god, you say yes. Some of you might remember that. But for Paul and Barnabas, step number one is to make sure the crowd knows that you are not a god. Before Paul can point these people toward God, he has to first get them to stop looking at himself. Stop looking at Barnabas. Now we might scoff at ancient people who believed in things that we now all think of as myths. But the need to get people to stop looking for the divine answer here among us has not gone away. Modern man has replaced myths with science, has abandoned idol worship and replaced it with self-worship, and has replaced sacrifices to the gods with self-indulgence in materialism. The outside package may look a lot different now, but man as a whole is still worshiping the wrong thing. Changing from worshiping the gods to worshiping himself isn't much of an improvement for humanity. Paul said to them, "We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from worthless things to the living God." Step number two, share the good news with them. The crowd would have been bummed to learn that Paul is not Hermes and Barnabas is no Zeus. But Paul has something much better to tell them. He has actual good news. Mankind has always sought divine answers to our problems. Few of the solutions that people have come up with have helped much at all. God, instead, offers a real fix, because unlike all those other solutions that we came up with, God actually has the power to do something to help us. This message does not need to change at all from Paul's day to our own. People still waste their lives on vain and fruitless pursuits that cannot satisfy. People still neglect their immortal soul to indulge their mortal flesh. How many of these latest and greatest dead-end attempts does mankind need to try before we realize that they are as worthless as the gods of wood and stone worshipped by the people of Lystra? Are youth and wealth and fame gods that will satisfy? No. Then why are they worshipped each day by millions who sacrifice to them to gain that which they will never be able to keep anyway? God, however, is offering something real, something eternal. Well, how can God do that? He's the living God. Being real instead of being a fantasy makes a difference here. It is to a God that really does exist and who really does care for humanity that Paul is trying to turn the hearts and minds of the people of Lystra. What will he tell them to show them the light? Paul talks about the God who created the world, who blesses and provides in it to this day. When he was in Pisidian Antioch preaching at the synagogue to Jews who knew about God, Paul focused on the scriptures and used them to introduce Jesus. But here at Lystra, Paul's audience doesn't have any of that background knowledge. They know nothing of Abraham and nothing of the revealed law of God given to Moses. So where's Paul supposed to begin? Paul begins simply by saying, God who created the heavens and the earth and everything in it. You see, to a polytheistic culture like this one that believed in many gods, that all sort of had a shared responsibility for the various parts of the world and all of the life in it, Paul's words are very radical. We live in an age where monotheism is triumphant over polytheism. You or I are much more likely to bump into someone who believes in no God than we are to bump into someone who believes in many gods. But in Paul's day, that was the exact opposite. And yet, the starting point is the same. Life exists here on earth. Intelligent life that can question its own existence and wonder how it got here and for what purpose. The ancient world had a different wrong answer to this essential question of human existence than the modern agnostic or atheist. But the correct answer remains the same. God created life in his own image. The ongoing debate as to how God did it is focusing on the account of Moses in Genesis and debating that with evolutionary biology is missing the important point. The ancients who believed in many gods had no ultimate end or final authority to turn to. Even if they appeased one god, they risked offending another. Hope in such a scenario is shaky at best, and faith has no firm foundation. Paul is offering them something much greater, the truth. There is only one God, the Father of us all. So today, the atheist who believes in no authority or purpose beyond the random dictates of chance and survival of the fittest is in the exact same dilemma as the quote-unquote primitive he or she would scoff at that believed in a whole host of gods. Without God, there is no answer to the question of why we are here. Is this life all that there is? Then the only answer to mankind's most enduring and compelling question, why are we here? If this is the only life, the only answer to that question can be, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Without one God, and one God only, who created you and I, and everyone for a purpose, the meaning of life is not only unknowable, but worthless. Why will the atheist ultimately need to turn to Christ, just as the people who believed in Zeus and Hera and Poseidon and all the rest of them? Because we were created as relational beings. The need to connect with the one in whose image we have been crafted is hardwired into our DNA. How do you go then from talking about the God who created you to the God who loves you? Paul focused on the kindness of God that everyone can see. The rain that falls to water the crops, the food that we harvest to sustain us, the joy that life can have, even when you don't know its purpose. You see, God has not left mankind alone in the dark. The blessings of God fall on the just and the unjust. His mercy falls on the deserving and the undeserving. Why? Think of it as the front porch light that apparently is on, so that a child will know the way home. That light is not only an aid to guide the journey, but also a reminder that our Father wants us to come home. It may seem to you that Paul was witnessing to a very different world than the one we live in. And he was. But the people who lived then are not very different than the ones who live now. We all need to come home. We all need to find our way to the living God. He was the answer to the question. He is the answer to the question, and he always will be. The need for the good news of Jesus Christ has not changed, and the message of repentance and forgiveness remains the same. We'll see how it ended for Paul and Barnabas here at Lystra in verses 18 through 20. Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul, dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. Even with those words, even with that pleading, Paul could barely get them to stop. You see, the beliefs of the people of Lystra were deeply held. They would not be set aside easily, as Paul and Barnabas barely stopped them from following through with the sacrifice. Well, that's very typical, is it not? Most people react negatively to having their beliefs challenged. A few will change, but many will bolster their defenses and fight back. We are told that some Jews came from Iconium and Antioch and won the crowd over. Now there are two groups confronting Paul. The Jews from outside of town and the locals that are confused. These two groups have nothing in common except this. Paul challenged the dearly held beliefs of both groups. Those from Antioch traveled 104 miles on foot to stop Paul from witnessing to Gentiles that they don't even care about. That is an extreme example of the backlash against the truth by someone trying to hold on to something less. For the people of Lystra, Paul and Barnabas have just burst their bubble. They've gone from celebrating having two gods walking among them to feeling somehow cheated or tricked, even though that false assumption was one that they themselves had made. Two different groups with two different reasons to be upset with Paul. It says they stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city thinking he was dead. Now the pain of that to you or I is obvious. The long-term scars and health problems must have been difficult for Paul for the rest of his life. The alternative to this situation, to have said nothing, to have let the sacrifices and the blasphemy take place for Paul and Barnabas was unthinkable. The price paid by Paul for the sake of the gospel was high. And yet, God had further plans for Paul. His body is now battered, but the spirit within Paul is still a consuming fire, anxious to save the lost. Jesus himself suffered more than this to reconcile humanity to God. Paul can continue to serve by the grace of God. It says the disciples gathered around him. Paul was not alone. The opposition may have been violent and ruthless, but the believers were loyal and still had their faith. They stood by Paul. They couldn't stop the crowd in its frenzy, but they're with Paul now. And we're told that he got up and went back into the city. What a sight that must have been. The man of God can be beaten, but his cause cannot be broken. Paul went back into the city. God wasn't finished with him yet. Now our message ends here at verse 20, but let me share something to you from verses 21 through 25 in closing. Paul and Barnabas went back through Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch on their return leg of their journey, strengthening the brothers and sisters in Christ in those towns. They went back to each of those towns. Those who opposed the gospel followed Paul 104 miles to try to kill him. But Paul came back to their town to minister to those who had found faith in Jesus Christ. That is the courage and the commitment that can only be found when you serve the living God.